Hi, and welcome to today's webinar, Pregnant Ewes, Are We Supplying What They Need? My name is Jodie Rizet O'Brien, and I'm part of the Sheep Connect SA team. Sheep Connect wouldn't be possible without the support of our funders, AWI, the SA Sheep Industry Fund, and the Department of Primary Industries and Regions. If you want to know more about Sheep Connect, you can go to our website, sheepconnectsa.com.au, or you can follow us on Twitter. Tonight's presenter is Deb Scammell. Deb is a livestock consultant at Talking Livestock, based in the mid-north of South Australia. She assists producers with nutrition and production planning in their sheep and beef enterprises. And over the last few years, Deb's keenly been involved in improving performance in lamb feedlots and feeding ewes in containment due to poor seasonal conditions. At this time, I'll hand over to Deb, who talked to us about pregnancy nutrition. Thanks, Deb.
Thanks for having me tonight. Tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about pregnancy and lactation and just are we giving ewes what they need? So obviously a bit of a dry start in most areas in South Australia. So once again, talking about supplementary feed requirements and trying to get ewes successfully through this pregnancy and lactation period we're all approaching. So what I'll be covering is basically your livestock requirements, why nutrition's mattering during pregnancy. So we'll be looking at what's going on with those fetuses, lamb survivability, and why we put so much importance on nutrition. We'll be looking at measures of success, which change from farm to farm, and also how to supply adequate nutrition. So we'll be looking at ingredients and the best ways for you guys to give the ewes what they need at various stages. So when we talk about livestock essential nutrients, I always put this graph up, this triangle, but I think it's really crucial to remember that that top segment of the triangle is quite important. So what we're talking about there is ME, which is metabolizable energy. So when I talk about energy, I like to look at it as the maintenance requirement of a ewe at their specific stage. So at the point of lambing, there's an energy requirement, which that ewe needs to maintain her current condition score and also grow that fetus out. So this is what we'll go through later in the webinar. We've also got a crude protein requirement. So I like to think of protein as when you're growing an animal. So protein's required if you think of sort of extra cells or extra growth within an animal. Lactation, where they're basically building protein, getting milk to supply to that growing fetus. So protein's crucial anytime you've sort of got growth and cell division. And the last one is fibre. So we've got it here as NDF, which is neutral detergent fibre. So we'll touch on this as well. So fibre is critical for rumen health, but it can also pull up intake. So you need to look at times that you need high value fibre and times you might have low value fibre. Down the bottom here, we've got vitamins, macro minerals and micro minerals. So they are important, but secondary to these energy and protein requirements. So I'll go through those towards the end of the webinar. So what we're looking at here is your standard sort of ruminant. So you've got your four stomachs all with their own sort of purpose of digesting this feed. But today I'm just going to focus on the rumen environment. So basically just putting up this diagram just to remind you that the rumen has these microbes that are basically digesting this feed as it's going through. So even though we're just trying to match raw energy requirements, you need to think about keeping that rumen healthy. So for example, if we're supplementing, in a containment setting maybe, but the animals are going back onto grass, we try and keep the feed relatively fibrous, so we're not doing a huge feed change prior to lambing. So we basically want to keep those fibre or fodder digesting bugs in the rumen rather than swapping suddenly from high grain diet to grass. Also needing your fibre level in the rumen. So a ruminant is a fibre digesting animal, so we need to keep those fibre levels high enough that it's slowing the rate of digestion of that energy dense feed and the rumen's able to break it down. So just always remembering your rumen health. Same as if we're suddenly introducing grain or energy dense feeds, we need to do it slowly enough that the rumen environment can handle it and we don't have to deal with other health issues like acidosis. So just something to keep in the back of your mind when you're working out what you're going to feed. So when we look at energy requirements, we've got this real rise over time from that maintenance energy required at joining. So looking at sort of a standard size 55, 60 kilo ewe, we're looking at around that 10 megajoules per day. And then as we go closer to that lambing period, you can see that really quick rise in energy requirement. And what we've got here, the bottom line there, the dotted line, is for your singles, and we've got the top line there for your twins. So you can see there's a substantial energy demand difference between your twins and singles, and just because that twin's growing out 2 fetuses rather than just 1. And then what we're looking at, for early lambers, or, depending on how late the real break comes, potentially there is going to be some requirement to keep topping up their feed through that lactation period. So you can see after that lambing period, there's that real significant rise in energy to support lactation requirements of a ewe, specifically when they're feeding 2 lambs. So during that period, we don't always meet 100% of their requirements, and they can at that point take some condition off their backs, provided you've got adequate recovery time before your next joining. So you may be not supplying all of those 30 megajoules, but will supply a reasonable quantity just to ensure they're not dropping too much condition through that lactation period. And we've also got to look at what the lambs require to hit high sort of growth rates as well. So in numbers, I've done this for your 60 kilo ewe. So when we talk about kilograms of a ewe, it's the standard reference weight of a ewe. So it's not their physical weight at the point of lambing with the weight of the fetus, but when we talk about standard reference weight, we're talking about the mature ewe weight when they're not pregnant in condition score 3, which we'll touch on condition scores shortly if you're not sure what they are. And that's with no wool on. So for merinos, if they've got 6 months wool, you'd have to take 6 months fleece weight off that weight over the scale. So these weights here, we've got a standard reference weight ewe of 60 kilos and one at 70 kilos. So, pretty common around some of our South Australian merino ewes. We've got here, your standard maintenance requirement of that 60 kilo ewe, just under 10 megajoules of energy a day for them to maintain condition. So if you're supplying less than that, they're going to lose condition. If you're supplying more than that, they're going to gain condition, as simple as that. A 70 kilo ewe, just with that larger frame size, a little bit of extra energy required at 11 megajoules per day to maintain condition. So you can see there, similar to what we've just seen on the graph, day 100 of pregnancy, they've jumped up a little bit there. At the point of lambing, we've got that 14.7 megajoules for a 60 kilo ewe and 17.2 for your twin bearing ewe. So a significant difference there on requirements, which we'll touch on shortly when we discuss a bit about scanning. But yeah, as I said, once you look at your lactation, so your peak lactation requirement is 20 to 30 days after lambing. And as you can see with that 70 kilo twin, you've got that requirement of 34 megajoules of energy per day. So that's not always possible to even get them to eat the quantity of feed to supply all of that energy. But as I said, if you're slightly under at that point, they'll lose a little bit of condition off their backs. And that's where our recovery period is really crucial before the next joining period. And, once you're down to lactation 3 months after lambing, your requirement's starting to drop back. When we look at why is it critical that we focus on nutrition through this pregnancy period, I guess there's so much going on inside with that fetus, and especially with wool producing sheep, that it's crucial that we sort of do get it right. So we've got that joining and, a standard sort of 35-day joining period. You've got your 2 cycles, your ovulation rate, and hopefully high levels of conception. But once you've conceived the fetus, what happens straight away during that first part of pregnancy is we've got the placenta being developed. So you've got that placenta development occurring. So you actually can restrict final fetus size if a ewe's severely underfed during that period of time. So you can develop a small placenta, which will never sort of have the energy to support a large fetus. So, there's definitely fetal growth at the end towards lambing, but the placenta and the size and production of that is happening early. What we've also got happening in the first trimester is your primary follicles, so your primary wool follicles being developed. So with your wool development, you've got your primary follicles, which are varying densities depending on nutrition. So if you've got an undernutritioned ewe, they're likely to have less density of primary follicles. The secondary follicles then form around these primary follicles. So you then can get less density of secondary follicles during that last trimester, and similar effect if they're undernutritioned at the end. So what we'd find then, if this was a group of ewe lambs that you're going to keep as replacements, they're potentially always going to have a lower wool cut just because of this follicle development that happened when they were fetuses. So the last thing we look at is sort of in the last trimester for the fetus, we've got that real significant fetal growth that occurs from day 90 through to lambing. So if an animal's severely underfed during that point, you'll find your fetus isn't large enough, and this will have flow-on effects to your lamb marking percent. If you go too hot on feed, specifically protein, you're likely to have significant fetal growth, and then you can end up with big lambs, dystocia, and low marking percents because of large lambs rather than small. And also sometimes ewe deaths if you've got significant lambs that aren't able to come out. With the ewe, we've got this udder development and colostrum production occurring at the end. So with perfect nutrition, she's going to have a good developed udder. You'll see that milk really bagging up. She'll have adequate colostrum to give that lamb a really good start to life. And then you can see there through to weaning, that lactation period, meeting protein and energy requirements means you'll get significant lamb growth, and through to weaning, you'll really hit your targets to set your lambs on their way to success. So, that's why we're so focused on nutrition during that pregnancy and lactation period, because it really does set up a successful result on your farm. So I guess the question is, what do they need? So, I look at these mobs of mixed ewes. So you can see here, we've got the twin ewe there on the left. The weather doesn't look that flash. We've got these other two single bearing ewes all in the same paddock. So as you saw from that graph, there's a significant difference in requirement. These ewes are probably going around peak lactation at this stage. In what these two ewes require. So what you'll find with the same feed regime, that twin bearing ewe will drop significant condition because she's trying to feed two lambs compared to that single, and also the growth rate of those twin lambs will be reduced compared to the single lamb. So, there's a really strong case for scanning, especially in times of supplementary feeding, just so you know exactly what each ewe does need. So when we look at pregnancy scanning, so this is some pretty old data, but still very correct. There's been some updates to the extra profit of ewes, which I'll go through shortly, that basically we've ended up with extra profit with scanning. But using this graph, just pointing out so you've got two types of scanning. You've got your wet-dry scanning, where you're just pulling out dries, and it can give you some extra profitability because you're not feeding your dry ewes. You're just feeding the pregnant ewes. But the biggest profit is basically scanning on litter size, and especially in a poor season. So knowing who your twins and singles are allows you to allocate the better quality feed and the more valuable feed to the animals that actually need it. And, I find in unscanned flocks, especially when we're supplementary feeding, we end up basically underfeeding the twins slightly and overfeeding the singles, which can cause issues in both mobs of ewes. So, in an average season where you've got plenty of paddock feed, the profitability can go back slightly because we're not spending as much on supplementation. And scan wet and dries will give you a small advantage, but not a significant advantage there. And, on the bottom scale of that graph is basically your scanning percentage. So as you conceive more numbers of fetuses per 100 ewes, so higher percent of twins and less dries, there's more value in being able to scan. So what we look at with this new project, so this has just been recently completed by the Adelaide University, and they've updated these profitability figures on the scanning results. So what they're looking at with a 5-year average, which was based on lamb price of, I think, around just over $5 a kilo, the profitability is $5.75 per ewe scanned. So that's just feeding the correct animals, marking extra lambs, is allowing us to achieve that extra profit. But what we look at with current sort of prices per kilo, which are a lot higher than that, this actually is at the moment coming up to about $10 per ewe scanned of profitability advantage. So based on the $5.75, over that 5-year average lamb price, we're looking at, for a 2,000 ewe flock, $11,500 of extra profit over the cost of scanning. So you're looking at a return on investment of 400%. So, something I'd really recommend having a serious look at post joining next year. When we talk about on farm, I like to, I guess, prompt you guys, like, what is your measure of success? So, we can talk about feeding correctly, scanning, how you're going to manage your ewes, but you need to have a good think about what success is to you. So is it an increase in marking percent? So I guess when I look at overall profitability, if you're running the same number of ewes, but you can increase your marking percent by 10%, with different management practices, that's a huge difference to your bottom line. So that's something I encourage you all to record, marking percent on ewes joined, not ewes through the yards, just so you can see year on year how your business is performing. Is it a decrease in mortality percent? So over drier times with supplementation, we sometimes do see higher mortality. We also see higher mortality in twin-bearing ewes. But keeping track of your mortality percent and getting this, closer to that industry sort of target of 2 to 3% is a real positive for your bottom line, but also for the industry. Is it higher quality progeny? So I guess, as I discussed, focusing on that nutrition through lactation, setting the lamb up for success with adequate colostrum, but also giving the ewe enough nutrition that they can give the lambs plenty of milk, means that you're going to get those higher quality progeny. You're going to hit your weaning weight targets. They're going to fly after weaning, and you're going to get them off your property as quickly as possible. Condition score of ewes. So we'll touch on condition scoring. But, for me, success, especially in a containment lot with a lot of supplementary feeding, is getting all of our ewes through to lambing. So twin-bearing merino ewes to target of 3.5 and getting a consistent condition score across the mob. So reducing that tail of skinnies that often let you down as far as mortality and decreased marking percent. And I guess what I see is focusing on all of these things, all related to nutrition during that pregnancy and lactation period, will definitely increase your profit on your livestock enterprise. So on to condition scoring. So, I strongly recommend lifetime ewe management if people haven't done it. It's the best way to really work out how you're condition scoring and get quite accurate at it. And it will also help you with pasture assessment and nutritional requirements during pregnancy. But when we talk about condition scoring, that blue line on this sheet is basically where the long true ribs are. And behind these true ribs, we've got the short ribs. So what we're doing with condition scoring is basically feeling the ends of the short ribs, feeling the coverage over that eye muscle area, and also the cover over the backbone. So I won't go through individual scores, but you can get these. AWI happily supply these lifetime wool cards. You can look them up online. They'll basically run you through each of the condition scores. Grab one of these cards, stand out in the yards and just have a go at it. So there's a good description of what each score is. But, with merino ewes, we're looking at a goal of about condition score 3. So that good eye muscle coverage, fingers running easily over the end of the short ribs, but, they're not fat over that region. That's your target for a single bearing ewe. We look at more like 3.5 for a mob of twin bearing ewes. And with maternal or crossbred ewes, we come back about 0.3 of a score on those condition score targets. So something worth having a go at if you haven't done it already. So, I guess, as we said, we've got these condition score targets for a reason, because there's a strong correlation between here. So mortality of merino ewes in late pregnancy in relation to condition score. So this was done in the Lifetime Wool project, presented now in the Lifetime Ewe program. But as you can see, once your single bearing ewes get below, you know, sort of that 2 score, you've got that significant increase in ewe mortality to much higher than targeted levels. And you can see there with your twin ewes, even more crucial. So, you know, at condition score 3.5, we're still getting reasonable levels of mortality, but these ewes are high risk animals. You're trying to get those 2 lambs to the correct weight and getting them to birth easily, and it's a high metabolic strain on a ewe, especially an older ewe. As you can see, you know, lambing twins in condition score 2.5, you're going to be relatively disappointed with your levels of ewe mortality. So there's that really strong relationship, and it is something we can control by monitoring nutrition and condition score of the ewes. So lamb survival also very highly correlated. So when we talk about lamb survival, we're looking at those higher birth weights to try and basically we're looking at the extra fat over that lamb and their ability to withstand weather, get up, follow their mum and get that first drink of milk. So, you know, we're looking at that sort of 4.5 to 5 kilos. Obviously with your twin lambs, that's going to be a pretty hard task, but, you know, every kilo we can get on that twin lamb, the more chance we've got of higher levels of survival. So you can see there, while we're looking at that 3.5 score target, that gives us, you know, 2 4-kilo lambs, which have a much higher chance of surviving than those lighter lambs coming from a lighter conditioned ewe. With your singles, you're naturally going to get one larger lamb because all the resources are going into one. But, you know, we can still end up with a large lamb that will cause issues, dystocia, birthing problems and brain damage to the lamb, or light lambs will still have inadequate survival. So, you know, when we look at our birth weight targets, you can see sort of at that 5 kilos, once you start to go over, you start to have reduced lamb survival. And that is because those birthing issues can cause the dystocia, which is brain damage. And some of those big healthy lambs will never be able to get up and suckle just because of the damage that's occurred through the birthing process. Once they get lighter, as I said, they just don't have the sheer fat on them to protect them, especially if we're having average weather or some wind chill or your high chill index in your lambing paddock. So lamb survival strongly improves by hitting your targets for birth weight. When we look as an industry, how many lambs are we losing? So, you know, this example, looking at merino ewes, you know, potentially twin-bearing ewes in maternal or crossbred flocks often slightly higher birth weight, you know, may have a little bit more fat. And, you know, some people are achieving higher marking percent, but, you know, there's definitely some achieving lower as well. So as a merino industry, you know, this is what we're sort of targeting is those 100 single bearing ewes will have 100 potential lambs. So, you know, scanned singles are going to have 100 fetuses. So we look at a target of 95% survivability, which will give us 95 live lambs at marking. When we look at 100 twin-bearing ewes, so that gives us 200 potential lambs or 200 fetuses in that mob. So looking at standard industry targets, we're sort of targeting 140% marking out of these 100 ewes. So that means we've lost 60 fetuses or 60 potential live lambs. And that's 70% survivability. So there's definitely people achieving much higher than this, but there's also people achieving a lot lower. So if you're lower than this, it probably is a good target to try and change your management on your twins and mark that sort of 140%. And if you're already achieving that, there's always sort of scope to improve on that too. So I guess looking at lactation nutrition, we're looking at basically with your milk production, what's required to get adequate milk, especially when we're looking at those 2 lambs or even 3 if you scan for triplets. So when we're talking milk production, as I said, you're trying to supply high quality milk to grow out quite a small lamb. So protein does start to become quite important. So, you know, during pregnancy, I look at that sort of 12% protein overall target. Towards the end, when they're about to lamb, we want around 14. And through lactation, we want around 14% protein in your overall ration, just so they can produce the quantity of milk to get that really high lamb growth rate, to get that lamb through to high marking and weaning weights. Energy is also crucial. So we've sort of touched on those high energy requirements through lactation, but, you know, lactation is the time in a dry season where you can bring in your high quality hay. So your vetch hay, your lucerne hay, maybe some high quality silage, or if you're grain feeding, you know, some lupins or a good high protein full feed pellet. So we're then looking at more of a swing towards protein, but still meeting energy requirements. As I said, you know, I see a lot of, I guess, the vetch hays, lucerne hays and things being put in, you know, in the last trimester before lambing. Good quality feed, but they're around 22% protein. So if they're not diluted with grain or a lower protein hay, you can end up with significant lamb growth at the end, which will give you a very large lamb. So when we look at what's in the paddock now, you know, as I said, most areas are still waiting for a decent break. So what we're sort of sitting on is dry feed. You know, some areas have had a bit of rain. We've got just this short, actively growing green feed. So, you know, when you're looking at your dry stalks, you've got quite low digestibility, the far right-hand side of this graph, which correlates to quite low energy feed. You know, so at the point of lambing for a single needing 15 megajoules of energy per kilo, you're not going to get it from these dry stalks. Active growth and that real short green feed will be very high digestibility, high energy feed, but the problem is whether you've got enough of it and also what the dry matter percentage is of that feed. So when we're down to dry stalks, stubbles, dry pasture paddocks, we're looking at about 90% dry matter. So that means 90% of that feed is dry and there's only 10% water. But when we're looking at the active growth green feed, we're looking only at about 10% dry matter. So that's the portion that contains the energy and protein, and 90% of that feed will be water. So that's something we need to consider when we first get a break. So, you know, what is green pick worth? And unfortunately, I feel like this is something we're going to see again this year, is ewes and little lambs or late pregnant ewes on this really short green pick. So, you know, I know a lot of people have been feeding quite a lot of feed over summer, but you can't suddenly pull out your supplementary feed, unfortunately. So, you know, when we look at what green pick's worth, so as I said, it's really high energy feed. So it's got 11 megajoules per kilo dry matter, high digestible feed, but it is 90% water. So to put that in perspective, and especially when you look at that image there, you imagine the ewes trying to harvest enough feed to meet their energy requirements during, again, peak lactation. So 1 kilo of green pick, which, you know, I feel like it'll take them quite a while to pick up a kilo, is only 100 grams of dry matter. So that's only going to give them 1.1 megajoules of energy for every kilogram of green pick consumed. So you imagine even to maintain themselves, they're going to have to eat 10 kilos of that green pick, which is going to be impossible. So that's where we need to keep our supplements in until the feed's got higher, hardened up, so higher dry matter, and can supply the ewes with everything they need. So looking at what supplementary feed works, so as I said, it will depend on a lot on where you're at. So whether you're in mid-pregnancy, late pregnancy, lactation, this equation changes, you know, every 10 days, basically their requirements are going to change on a sliding scale. So looking at this year's hay, we are fortunate, especially with the barley prices, you know, going through the roof. Full feed pellets are getting pretty hard to get. The hay this year has been incredibly good quality. So strongly recommend doing a feed test. And if you do a feed test, so I send them to feed test in Victoria, just over $60 a sample, and they'll send you back this information. So the crucial things to look at is your dry matter percent at the top there. So, you know, hay's always around that 90% dry matter, 10% moisture, similar to this one. You can see there your crude protein. So this was just a mid-north wheaten hay. Your crude protein just over 11%, which is brilliant. We've got there your neutral detergent fibre. So that's the digestible fibre of this hay. So that's 51.5% of the hay, which is quite low. So the year prior, so 2020 hay, the average was more like 60 to 65% fibre. And that's because the hay was cut a bit late, got a bit ranker, a bit more fibrous. And what it will do, it will mean that the ewe can't consume as much. So when you've got a higher fibre hay, it'll basically fill the rumen up. They'll run out of space. They'll be trying to digest it. And it'll slow the throughput of other feeds. So NDF is a critical number to look at, especially with pregnant ewes. So twin bearing ewes at the end, right prior to lambing, they've got a real belly full of the two twins and they don't have a lot of gut space. So looking at higher quality, lower fibre feeds at that point, more energy dense feed is absolutely critical. And the last thing we look at is your digestibility, which gives you a metabolizable energy figure. So we've got that 9.9 megajoules per kilo of dry matter. So, looking back at that 60 kilo raw ewe energy requirement of 9.9, basically a kilo of this hay will allow you to maintain a dry 60 kilo ewe. So we then need to look at what we can put on top for pregnancy or lactation. Running through some other feed test results. So, when you've got an issue with gut space, twins at the end of lambing, even singles really, you're going to have to look more towards more energy dense feeds. So I've just given you some rough average feed test results for this year, but I can't mention enough to get your own feed tested. So, then you can ring someone with an accurate idea of where it's sitting, because, even barley grain this year, I've had it testing from 9 up to 14%, depending on where it's coming from in protein. So it makes a big difference to those, protein requirements, whether you're needing to add lupins or something else for protein, or whether your barley's high enough on its own. So you've got your barley grain there, 90% dry matter, which is around usual for barley. Most of the barley I've tested this year has been around that 13 to 13.5 megajoules per kilo of dry matter, which is quite good. So that means every kilo you're feeding in dry matter, you're getting that 13.2 megajoules for this barley tested, 11.2 protein, and your NDF low on energy dense grains. So your lupins there, you can see, similar dry matter, slightly lower in energy. But where we would use lupins is when you're not meeting protein requirements from your barley grain alone. So we'd put a little bit in through pregnancy and maybe some more in during lactation, just to meet those higher protein requirements. We've got oats there. Oats are often slightly lower in energy, maybe slightly lower in protein, although I've seen some really good high protein oats this year. And your fibre level will be up slightly on oats, but they can still be a really valuable feed. We've got there your full feed pellets. So, they're often at 90% dry matter, around 10 megajoules of energy, but different manufacturers have slightly different specs. And they can be sort of 13 to 14% protein, depending on what pellet you've got. And, around that 34% NDF, but there are some manufacturers that have more of a hay-based pellet that NDF can be quite high. So it can be just worth checking how much fiber's in that pellet. So, we've got your cereal hay and your vetch hay there, which I've gone through sort of the role for both of those. But yeah, looking at, I guess, what feed's going to suit during the best time is critical. There is a resource available. We did 2 parts of a feed budgeting webinar last year. So you can access that resource online too if you want more detail on how to actually formulate a feed budget. So, I guess the key from this webinar is just looking at which feed is fit for purpose. So, are you at the pointy end of pregnancy, close to lambing? That fibrous hay may not be suitable as 100% of your diet. So you do need to look at some energy dense feed, a barley, a pellet, where, early in pregnancy, mid-pregnancy, or even at the end of pregnancy for a single with high quality hay, that fibrous, good quality hay may suit the purpose. So when we look at fibrous feed, an equation I always go back to is basically just the NDF equation. It was developed on dairy cattle, applicable to beef or sheep, and it will help you work out how much a ewe can actually eat. So I'll go through the wheat and hay example I put up before from the feed test. So quite high quality mid-north wheat and hay. So we've got a 60 kilo merino ewe. So the intake of that ewe is 120 divided by the NDF figure off that feed test. And this is just a standard equation you can use on any fibrous feed. And that'll give you the percent of body weight that ewe can consume. So looking back at the wheat and hay, we had 54% NDF. So we've done 120 divided by 54, comes out at 2.2% of their body weight. So that means that ewe will be able to eat 1.32 kilos of dry matter of that wheat and hay. So what we do then is just look at the energy available in that hay. So that feed test also told us that hay had 9.3 megajoules of energy available per kilo of dry matter. So when we times that by the 1.32 kilos they can consume, we end up working out this hay will supply 12.3 megajoules per day of energy. So, slightly better than just maintenance for a 60 kilo ewe, but it's not going to supply you that high 14 to 15 megajoule that a single bearing 60 kilo ewe needs to lamb down, and especially not what a 60 kilo twin bearing ewe would need to lamb down. So, some high quality pasture with this hay would be perfect. If you're relying on supplementary feeding, you would need to put some grain with that hay. So something worth looking at if you are looking at hays, and I find it varies year to year, and that's where you need to have another look at the fibre level, energy level, protein level, and work out how much the animal can physically eat. So the last thing I'll touch on is your major mineral requirements. So it is crucial, through areas that have supplemented heavily over the last 3 to 4 years with the dry starts and sort of shorter growing seasons, we are starting to see some metabolic issues. So you can end up with higher levels of ewe mortality due to calcium and magnesium deficiency. And you'll also see some deaths due to preg tox if you're supplying inadequate feed. But looking at the mineral side, it'll be that calcium and magnesium often coming into lambing that'll let you down. So what we're looking at, with your young animal or a dry animal, their maintenance requirement of calcium is quite low. With your dry ewe, 50 kilo ewe, only 1.6 grams of calcium a day. But as the problem is when we're feeding grain, which is quite deficient in calcium, we'll end up with a higher level of calcium required just to balance out the grain, which is very high in phosphorus and very low in calcium. But by the time we get to late pregnancy, the calcium requirement's also gone up. So what happens is animals will start to draw on their bone supplies, but if they've been deficient over summer and grain feeding in early pregnancy, what you'll find by late pregnancy, or especially in older ewes, you may not have any calcium left to draw on. And that's where you'll see ewes starting to drop in the back legs and go down from calcium deficiency. So anytime you're doing supplementary feeding that's not balanced, so grain, hay, I'd always recommend having a calcium source out. So with your magnesium, once you get towards late pregnancy and lactation, there's also that significant increase in magnesium requirements. So magnesium can also help with the ease of lambing, and it helps with that sort of muscle function. So, I'm a strong believer in putting, a decent calcium magnesium product out at least sort of 4 to 6 weeks prior to lambing. But critical anytime ewes are on deficient feed, stubbles, or anytime they're being grain fed, to keep calcium up to them to balance out that supplementation as well. So I'll just run through a couple of example rations. So, these are very specific to this hay I've tested, which was a very high quality oat and vetch hay, and the barley for this particular producer. So, depending on your feed test, these levels will change, but it gives you an idea of, how a healthy ration would work for a single and twin bearing ewe. So I'm looking at 60 kilo ewes. So at 150 days, which is right on the point of lambing, the single's needing 14.7 megajoules of energy per day, and the twins needing 17.2 megajoules per day. So, in a bare paddock, no pasture available, if you're doing too much less energy a day than this, you are at risk of losing ewes with pregnancy toxemia. So the single ration, 36 cents per ewe per day. We've got 200 grams of barley supplying a little bit of their energy. And then because this oat and vetch hay is good protein, low fibre, they can consume plenty. We're able to give them just ad lib oat and vetch hay, and they're going to eat about 1.4 kilos per ewe per day. Now, the twin ration, substantially different, just because, as I said, that gut space, that 60 kilo ewe is going to struggle to eat too much more than that 1.1 kilos per day of good quality cereal hay. So we're having to give them more energy dense barley at 650 grams a day to supply those daily high energy requirements and get them through successfully. And next, we're looking at the lactation requirements. So for the same 60 kilo ewes, as I said, lactation will peak sort of 20 to 30 days after lambing. So the singles are needing a huge amount of energy at 24 megajoules a day, and the twins are over 30 megajoules a day. So as I said earlier, you're not always going to supply this. So, singles, I'm looking at 48 cents per ewe per day. We're going to give them 500 grams of barley, and they're still going to get ad lib access to that good hay where they'll eat about 1.4 kilos. Again, both of these rations are supplying about 5 megajoules less. So, those ewes will drop, potentially half a condition score or even more over lactation. But provided we've got a normal joining, and we'll have feed ahead of them to pick them back up again. So I'm not particularly concerned, but it will all depend on your recovery time and your pasture you can put those ewes onto later. So your twin bearing ration there, 72 cents per ewe per day. So we've got 1.2 kilos of barley and 1.2 kilos of good quality hay. So basically ad lib of everything you can throw at them to try and meet that significantly large requirement. So, that will ensure you do get lambs with high growth rates and, keep those ewes in reasonable condition. So the key take homes from tonight that I want you guys to think about as you're planning out your sort of lambing lactation rations, I guess the most critical place to start is what are your stocks requirement until the break. So, some areas have had a small amount of rain, some haven't yet, but, I guess reminding you that short green pick isn't going to be valuable in the short term. So, after a decent break, it's still going to be 6 to 7 weeks before you get reasonable feed value that you can start to back off on your supplementary feeding. So we really need to plan ahead with stock requirements. Also, just reinforcing that preg scanning message. So, when you look at those individual pregnancy and lactation rations, they're substantially different for singles and twins. And, obviously, if you've got some dry or empty ewes kicking around, they're going to be fat as a house by the end of the season after eating all of that grain and hay with no lamb on board. So knowing who needs the feed and supplying the expensive feed to the right animals is crucial. Then we look at what are the best ingredients to supply energy and protein. So it is choosing the energy dense feeds at the right time, the high protein feeds at the right time, and, giving them the feeds that work, keeping in mind things like adequate fibre, but also gut space and how much fibre they can actually eat. So we do need to work out a bit of a feed budget and a ration that they can actually consume per day. And I guess the key really is to just plan ahead to ensure success. So, looking at from the point of joining, we can work out an average or an even late break this year. Plan out what you're going to need and what's going to give you the result you need so that you can tick all those boxes as far as success for your ewes and your livestock enterprise. Thank you all for your time.
No worries. Thanks, Deb. Just a reminder to everyone, if you've got a question, pop it in the Q&A box. You can even pop it in the chat box, or if you've got my mobile number close at hand, you can flick me a text and I'll pop those through to Deb. Deb, we talked about feed testing and you mentioned the cost, which you said had gone up to approximately...
Oh, I think it's about $63 now. I should know off the top of my head because you ask me all the time, but I have forgotten. But I think it's around 63-ish.
Yep. And so what are the sort of, where can we send our feed test samples if we want to send them off? Which of the companies?
Yeah, so I've always used Feed Test in Victoria. So I think it's just feed. Yeah, if you just literally Google Feed Test, it's feedtest.com.au, something like that. But your local resellers will often have bags that and they'll have their sort of preferred companies. But if you're not close to one of those, just look up Feed Test. They'll send the bags out, and it's good to have a heap on hand. And then just send them off with your credit card details when you need one done.
Fantastic. Yep, I've just got some at home. So yep, certainly give them a buzz and they'll flick them in, put them in the post to you, and you'll have them in quick time. Deb, the next one I had is what sort of tools are out there for producers? We've gone through some calculations tonight for producers to do their feed budgets and their costings at home. Have you got some recommendations about things to have a look at, which sort of apps, etc.?
Yeah, so there's a good drought feed calculator that New South Wales DPI have put out. So same, you can just Google drought feed calculator, or we could potentially send some links out after this webinar. But that one allows you to compare the value of ingredients, so you can actually put in your energy, protein, fibre level, dry matter of all your ingredients, and then you can compare the best value feeds to use depending on whether you're chasing energy or protein. And it also allows you just to do a real simple feed budget for just 2 or 3 ingredients. So that's probably the best, easiest one to use. The hard part is when you look at full supplementation of or containment feeding of ewes, there's a lot of experience about sort of using fibre levels, getting your energy right, but also keeping the rumen healthy. So if you haven't done it before, it potentially is good to just get someone to help you with your first lot of rations. And then I think over time you get quite experienced at what works well with feeding your own ewes.
Fantastic. Yep, we've got time for any more questions if people want to pop those in, and I'll put those to Deb. Just a reminder, tonight's webinar is recorded, and we'll put that up on the Sheep Connect SA YouTube channel in the coming days. And I encourage you to revisit this, share it with your neighbours and friends if they haven't been able to join our webinar tonight. So I encourage that. So, yep, Deb, I think that's the end of the questions. Deb, I'd like to thank you for sharing your expertise with us tonight and your experiences. It's always great to have those key take-home messages that we can all put into place tonight, sit down and do our feed budget. So thank you so much. I thank all of you for joining our webinar tonight. So thank you, enjoy your evening, and we'll catch up with you next time. Cheers.